I'm going to tell you a story about William Abraham Nixon before he came to the United States. I had asked my nephew, Claire Nixon, who is or was at that time, a professor at A&M, Texas A&M in Texas. And he was traveling quite extensively throughout the world. And so I asked him to see if he could find some information at the University of Bangor. And in the process, he hired someone to do some research, and she found William A. Nixon and his wife Bridget and two of the children living in Carnarvon in Wales. And they were on Tanroll Street. And so he also found a picture in a book of Tanroll Street in Carnarvon. And I had tried to reproduce this as an artist, and I am not an artist. So I asked my cousin, who is an architect and is a very, very good artist, if he would do it for me. And this is the picture that he came up with. And so this is the home of William A. Nixon in one of these tenements on Tanroll Street in 1841. When Richard and I traveled to Europe, our daughter was, her husband was stationed at Lakenheath in England, and so we went to Wales. And while we were there, we discovered that William Abraham and Bridget, there were two additional children. And we found the birth of Edward and the death of Edward, and then there was a daughter, Anne. We found her birth, but we have not found her death. So there were two additional children that we didn't know about that died before they came to America. James William Nixon talks about William Abraham Nixon after they, well, actually, he tells how he was born in Liverpool and that they moved to Bangor, Wales. He didn't refer to this time that they were in Carnarvon. And we can establish the fact that they did move to Bangor through a birth record of one of the sisters, Jenny. She was applying for a pension from the government, and on this pension application she indicates that she was born, I think it was 1843, in Bangor, Wales. So we have sources to establish that this is undoubtedly the point that they left from when they came to America. Well, after they arrived in America, I found in a book called Pen Pals of Minnesota, this is kind of interesting, and in this is just a little blurb about William Abraham. He was selling apples out of an apple cart, and in the blurb it said, he could make more money than anyone they've ever known. And he was very good with his finances. After the apple cart, he ended up having a business establishment in St. Paul, and I don't know if anyone is familiar with taipan trading. Why this business established in St. Paul in 1856 could be compared to that large of a merchandising establishment as taipan trading is here in Utah and California. And as a sidelight, taipan trading, just to show the generation that the merchant genes runs in the Nixon family, and is that one of J.W. Nixon's descendants is one of the proprietors of taipan trading. Nick Stewart. Nick is the grandson of Grace Nixon Stewart and great-grandson of James William Nixon. So after 1852, they were in St. Paul. Things did not work out as far as his first marriage was concerned. He had to divorce Bridget, and then after that he remarried Mary Elizabeth Perrin and then moved to St. Cloud. In 1856, this large mercantile store burned to the ground, and it was at this time, soon after, that their son, James William Nixon, took a course to come to California and then got tied up with the Mormons and didn't go further than Salt Lake and was baptized in Salt Lake City about 1857. But William A. Nixon moved to St. Cloud and established another mercantile store. And according to some of his descendants, this Rhea Howell, he made several trips back and forth to Europe in order to buy merchandise for his store there in St. Cloud. In the early 1870s, James William Nixon was called on a mission. This James William, his son, for the LDS Church, and he was called to go back to Minnesota and take the gospel to his family. He wasn't successful. However, he did bring his father out to Utah, and William A. Nixon did spend a year here in Utah and to spend a lot of his time at Mount Trumbull. So but then he went back to St. Cloud, and his wife passed away and caused him some grief with his second family. They had persuaded Mary Perrin Nixon to will all of the possessions to the second family. They didn't want the first family to have any of the inheritance, and so they persuaded their mother to will them the property, and it left the husband a lot of his property was taken away from him. And we've got a letter that he was very upset at his second family for doing this, and as a result he did have some property that they didn't know about that he later willed to the first family, so they did get some of the inheritance. But he was a very industrious individual and very, very talented in the way of merchandising and how to make money. And I think this in lots of times has been also inherited by many of his descendants. I think the next person we should maybe talk a little bit about is his son, the ancestor of so many, James William Nixon I. And after the store burned in 1856, he decided to come west and was converted to the church in Salt Lake City. 1857, he was baptized in City Creek, and then he tells in his biography or autobiography that he went out to Echo Canyon during the Johnston's army coming to Utah to squelch the Mormons, while he was part of the Echo Canyon military that tried to forestall him coming into Utah. And then he tells in his autobiography that he also went out to the fort, the military fort that the Johnston Army, I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, he did some work out there before he was married. And I believe it was in 1859 that he marries Johanna, and they first establish a home up on the Weber. They have several children up there, and then they come back to Salt Lake City, and he learns the tinner's trade. October of 1865, he's called to go to Dixie. And he doesn't go until January of it was 64 that he's called to go. No, let me just, October of 65. And it's in January of '66 that he takes his family down to St. George. Now, if you stop to think of traveling in the wintertime between Salt Lake and St. George, it was not an easy trip. And the minute they arrive in St. George, this is what blows my mind. He pitches a tent, he leaves Johanna and the 3 little girls in the tent, and he takes off for California to buy tinner's tools. And so she's there almost 3 months living in a tent while he's off trying to buy the tools so that he can pursue his occupation as a tinsmith. And then his son tells of him building the home in St. George, and that he had his shop first in the basement of his home. And it was interesting, I was reading just this morning where James, his son, was downstairs in the basement with his father, and he was manhandling the equipment, the cogs, and he got his finger caught in the cogs, and it was taken off. And the first reaction to his father was he gave him a spat. He says, "Why didn't you know better than to put your fingers on the equipment?" And then he took him in his arms and loved him, and he says, then he bound up the finger, put the finger back on his hand, bound it up, and lo and behold, it took, and he had a finger the rest of his life that was just a little bit shorter. But that all happened when J.W. Nixon II was about 4 years old. I thought that was kind of an interesting insight into their life. So James W. was very prosperous in St. George. About 1872, the latter part of 71 to 72, Brigham Young called him to go to Pioche. And Pioche, Nevada was just at that time was a booming mining camp, mining town. And it was noted to be one of the worst mining towns in all of the United States. And there was a murder, I think, almost every night. And can you imagine taking your family to that environment? But Brigham Young had asked him to go there and mine the miners. And then there was open up a merchant's store, and we have his diary of 1872, and it tells of the dozens and dozens and dozens of eggs that he sells to the miners. Well, he was very successful. He came back with over $24,000 in gold. Everything was in gold. What was interesting is when Richard and I went over to Pioche, I said, "We've got to go to Pioche, Richard." And so we went over to Pioche. I went into the courthouse and found the deed. In January, I think he paid about $400 or something for the lot that he had there. And by December, he resold it for over $3,500. So he just was knew how to make money. And then he came back to St. George. I guess Pioche was starting to run down, and the mining was going in other areas. So he came back to St. George, and at that time, about 1873 and the first part of 74, they started the United Order. And most people don't, even though he wrote an autobiography, he didn't go into a lot of detail about his experience as president, vice president, and president of the United Order. But I'm writing a history and showing the responsibilities that this man had the last 10 years of his life. It wasn't easy. The first year, most of the settlements, now this United Order was not the United Order of St. George. It was the United Order of St. George Stake. So this incorporated all the surrounding settlements. And so he would have to go and travel to the different settlements. He tells of going to Rockville and what's the town near the Zion's Canyon? I can't think of it right off. What is it?
Hurricane?
No, not Hurricane. It was anyway. It's the town just as before you go into Zion's Canyon. But anyway, these are the little towny surrounding areas, and they baptized people into the order. Now, most people didn't realize that this was an ordinance. And in the record by James Bleak, which is the Annals of the Southern Mission, why he gives this ordinance that and exactly what was said was they baptized these people. And when I went to Salt Lake to the library and dug out the records of the United Order of St. George, why he baptized well over 100 people into the order, but the first year things seemed to be going pretty well, but then by the end of the year, why the people just weren't ready for this commitment to give everything. When he went into the he put more into the order than anyone else. The ledgers show that he put in close to $8,000, and I think the next person that was anywhere near him was about $1,200 or something like that. So he really gave his all, and I think this is one of the reasons why he was put on as the board of directors. But he believed in this commandment that Brigham Young was trying to get the people to live, and he up to the very end. One thing I wanted to bring out is at the end, when it was dissolving, he ended up with Mount Trumbull, which was according to his son, was not an asset. It was more of something that was a thorn in his side. But I found a letter where he was committed he went into debt in order to get Mount Trumbull. And he was trying to saw out his debt with the lumber. And in this letter in 1880, it tells that the last of the lumber was sawed, and it was to be used in the tower of the St. George Temple. So every time the descendants of J.W. Nixon look at the St. George Temple and see that tower, they know that their great-grandfather or their ancestor gave his all in order for that to. He was coming very ill. He had developed cancer in 1880, and he just gave everything he could in order to fulfill that commitment. It was a testimony to me of the great example he is to his descendants to commit themselves to the Lord and to do and obey the commandments. But he really, as I write his history, it's just unbelievable to me what he was able to accomplish. And here he raising his family as well. And the last 10 years of his life were the hardest, I think.